Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you enjoy this episode or this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Warfare now is so different than what it was for the vast, timeless majority of history. Whereas war was a brutal, hand-to-hand trial of combat where you looked your foe in the eye, watched him die and bleed out, then moved on to the next. It's now separated by vast distances. I mean, we don't even see our enemies through scopes anymore. They might be coordinates or pixels on a drone screen. That's why the Napoleonic Wars are so fascinating to me. It was perhaps the last great era where you fought one-to-one, man-to-man, and yet the absolutely gory terror of technology was introduced en masse. Can you imagine a battalion of men lined up, shoulder to shoulder, standing fast, awaiting the order to fire, then charging, rushing, and fighting your foes with blades, with rifle butts, with rocks, and with fists. Then, out of the smoke-filled atmosphere which camouflaged your enemy, so you didn't know precisely where they were at, a light. Then thousands of steel balls eviscerating the men next to you, dozens fallen and bleeding out. You are ordered to close ranks, so you step over the wounded and dying men. The front lines fire, and you rush forward to fight to the death. You or him, you or them. It's not like that now, but it's my belief that the vast scores of humanity today would be so absolutely repulsed by the purity of the violence that nation-states would erupt in rebellion in an effort to save their boys and their men from these fates. The Battle of Nations, as today's episode is called, was such a battle. Technological manpower mixed with swords and bayonets. Let's now experience the Battle of Leipzig.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 51, The Battle of Leipzig, the 16th through the 18th of October, 1813. Allied European forces, three armies comprised of 57,000 Prussians, 160,000 Austrians and Russians, with 65,000 Swedes and Russians. Napoleon's French forces, 160,000 soldiers. The Allied triumph at Leipzig shattered the last vestiges of Napoleon's once unshakable power. This decisive blow opened the path for the invasion of France, and within months, the emperor who had bent Europe to his will was forced to surrender his throne, marking the end of his reign in the following year.
In the dead of winter, 1812, Napoleon's ambitions lay frozen on the Russian steppes. His once mighty army shattered, with corpses and broken men marking the path of his retreat. The Grand Army, 500,000 strong, was now but a specter of its former glory. Europe watched, convinced that the Titan had finally fallen, his days of conquest over. No one could have predicted the ferocity of his return. Napoleon arrived in Paris long before the full tale of his Russian disaster could spread. As whispers of his defeat slowly slithered through Europe, the emperor was already forging a new army from the bones of tomorrow, plundering future conscripts as if time itself was to his command. The new Grand Army was filled with boys barely old enough to hold a musket, their youth betrayed by faces untouched by the scars of war. Yet their hearts burned with the zeal of those who still believed in the legend of Napoleon. Enthusiasm, not experience, would fuel their march. To steady his untested legions, Napoleon pulled hardened veterans from Spain, men who had seen blood and fire under the Iberian sun. With these battle-worn soldiers at their side, the army turned east, toward the lands that had once bowed before the French emperor, but now rallied against him in defiance. In the years of his ascendance, Napoleon had crushed nations beneath his boot and bent them to his will, binding them in reluctant alliances. But the Russian disaster had loosened those chains, and one by one the vassals of his empire began slipping from his grasp. Though his iron grip over northern and eastern Europe was weakening, Napoleon knew that he had only one true threat: unity among his enemies. Alone, they were mere sparks. Together, they could become the inferno that would consume him. By early 1813, the specter of a united front seemed distant. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and the scattered German states circled each other like wolves, wary of who might lunge first. Distrust rippled through their ranks, each power fearful of what the others might claim in the wake of Napoleon's fall. Instead of seeing the looming threat of Napoleon's rejuvenated army, they fixated on the power vacuum that would follow his downfall, each of them calculating who might rise to dominate Europe next. This fear of the unknown future paralyzed their present, threatening to unravel any hope of swift cooperation. At the center of this storm stood Austria's foreign minister, Karl von Metternich, a man whose cunning had already steered Europe's fate for years. Since 1807, he had maneuvered in the shadows of courts and of battlefields, even brokering the marriage between Napoleon and Marie-Louise, daughter of Austria's Emperor Francis I, a bond now fraying with the winds of war. By 1813, Metternich's ambitions shifted. The alliance he once nurtured, forged through diplomacy and marriage, was now a weapon he would turn against the French emperor. He sought nothing less than a total ruin for Napoleon. Bringing Russia, Prussia, and the rest to the table was no easy feat. Suspicion still lingered, but Metternich's persistence bore fruit. By March, he had assembled the Sixth Coalition, an alliance of Austria, Prussia, Russia, Sweden, and Great Britain, an unholy union forged to bring down the Titan. The gears of war turned swiftly. Soon, 100,000 soldiers stood ready between Dresden and Magdeburg, the vanguard of a force bent on shattering Napoleon's reign forever. Always a tactician, Napoleon knew the path to victory lay in the same ruthless strategy that he had once brought Europe to its knees. He would strike each enemy in isolation, crushing them one by one before they could gather into an unstoppable storm. Yet even for the master of war, two monumental obstacles loomed before him. His new army, green and untested, lacked the iron discipline of veterans. Worse still, his cavalry, the eyes and fists of his empire, had been decimated in Russia, leaving him relatively blind on the battlefield and hamstrung in pursuit. Without his cavalry, the battlefield was a fog of uncertainty. Napoleon, once able to outmaneuver his enemies with a lethal precision, now found his ability to gather intelligence crippled. The enemy could lurk anywhere, and the emperor's power to strike at them with surgical force was dulled. But Napoleon was never a man to hesitate. Through the spring and summer of 1830, he moved swiftly among his enemies, relentlessly seeking an opening. On May the 2nd, Napoleon clashed with the Prussians at Lutzen. His genius carried the day, scattering the enemy, but the absence of cavalry left him vulnerable. Unseen, a force struck at his flank. Though he repelled the assault and seized Leipzig, victory eluded him. It was a blow struck, but not a fatal one. Napoleon had failed to land the knockout that he needed. Relentless, the French stormed Dresden, taking the city in a swift fashion. But just days later, at Bautzen, the Russians awaited him. On May the 20th and the 21st, they clashed, two massive forces locked in blood and fury. Once more, Napoleon hurled his enemies from the battlefield, but still, they slipped from his grasp, the decisive blow forever just beyond reach. The butcher's bill from those two savage engagements was staggering. 38,000 men lay dead or dying on either side, their sacrifice yielding no clear victor. Soon after, grim news reached Napoleon's ears. Vast armies converged upon him from all directions, north, south, east, tightening the noose. Facing this impending storm, he sought a brief respite and secured a truce on June 4th, buying him 2 precious months. During this fragile pause, both Napoleon and his enemies braced for the next round, furiously building strength and stockpiling the weapons of war. On June the 26th, Metternich confronted Napoleon in Dresden, the two men locking horns in a grueling 9-hour battle of words. Yet no peace was to be found. Neither would bend, and the war would continue. Metternich's terms were brutal, a lasting peace, but only if Napoleon surrendered nearly all of the land he had seized beyond France's natural frontiers. Such terms would strip France of her glory, forcing her to relinquish the prized Rhine, the triumphs of Italy, and the spoils of Spain. It was a humiliation that Napoleon could never accept. Napoleon's refusal was as swift as it was certain. Metternich would later claim that the offer was a trap. a move designed to paint Napoleon as the villain in a war he could not escape. But Napoleon would not surrender. He would fight to the end. The emperor knew all too well that accepting such terms would spell the end of his reign. The French people, intoxicated by empire, would never stand idle, while Europe's dominion was torn from their grasp. To remain their leader, Napoleon would need to fight until the last breath. When the truce shattered on August the 16th, the ground trembled beneath the weight of two colossal armies. Napoleon had gathered his legions. His enemies had multiplied. Europe stood on the brink of a battle unlike it had ever seen before. Napoleon commanded 300,000 men scattered across Germany. As a strategist, he positioned a corps at Hamburg, daring to threaten the Prussian rear, while another held Dresden, guarding the Bohemian frontier. True to his ruthless efficiency, Napoleon's men spread across the countryside, foraging the land to sustain themselves, yet always within a day's march of one another, ready to converge like wolves on any foe foolish enough to strike. The Allies, wary of Napoleon's genius in open battle, chose a different path. They would avoid direct confrontation with the emperor himself, instead wearing down his subordinates, striking wherever his lieutenants faltered, until they could muster a force vast enough to crush him once and for all. And so they began. On August the 23rd, Swedish Crown Prince Bernadotte, once a marshal under Napoleon but now his sworn enemy, shattered Marshal Eudenaut's forces at Grossbeeren, south of Berlin. 3 days later, Prussia's Marshal Gebhard von Blücher crushed Marshal MacDonald at Katzbach, sending the French reeling in that defeat. Napoleon now faced a relentless enemy on too many fronts. He and his troops were driven to exhaustion, constantly on the move, racing from one front to another, attempting to prop up beleaguered subordinates as the Allies closed in from all sides. When news reached him of an Austrian strike on Dresden, Napoleon forced his exhausted, battle-weary army into yet another furious march. His sheer will turned back the Austrians, but his troops, drained and battered, couldn't press the advantage. Victory slipped through his fingers yet again. September and early October brought more clashes, each bloodier than the last. Battle after battle drained the French. Overwhelmed by the growing pressure from all sides, Napoleon was forced to fall back to Leipzig, his enemies closing in for the kill. By October the 15th, Napoleon's situation had grown desperate. Blücher's Prussians advanced from the north, but the far larger Austrian army of Bohemia, led by Prince Karl von Schwarzenberg, approached from the south. Napoleon now stood between two fires. The army of Bohemia was a monstrous force, 160,000 strong, a coalition of Austrians and Russians under the command of Prince Karl von Schwarzenberg. It was a tidal wave of men and steel, threatening to swallow Napoleon whole. Dawn broke on October the 16th, 1813. A thick mist clung to the battlefield. Napoleon deployed his forces in this fog-shrouded land, knowing both armies had massed their artillery. As the guns roared to life, it was the cannon that dealt death by the thousands. Steel and fire wreaking havoc on men and earth alike. The village of Wachau became the heart of the slaughter. Throughout the brutal day, it fell and was reclaimed 3 times. Its streets soaked in blood. Its ruins echoing with the cries of dying men. By midday, Prince Karl's troops had seized the town, tightening their grip. But Napoleon was far from finished. He unleashed his own assault, striking with all the ferocity that had made him a terror on the battlefield. The terrain was treacherous. Streams, marshes, and thick woods crisscrossed the battlefield, favoring those who could dig in and defend. But Napoleon did not seek defense. He sought to break his enemies utterly. Napoleon's plan was savage in its simplicity. He would unleash his massed artillery, pounding the Austro-Russian line into submission. Then, with precision and ruthlessness, he would swing left and roll up the Allied forces, trapped in a tightening semicircle east of Leipzig. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Napoleon's guns began their thunderous assault. For an hour, they battered the Austro-Russian lines. When the enemy began to falter, he turned to Marshal Murat, ordering his cavalry forward, and the charge began. Murat's 10,000 cavalry stormed into the fray, sweeping aside the first ranks of enemy troops. But Tsar Alexander, watching from the rear, was quick to react, commanding his reserves to bolster the southern flank. When the Russian reserves slammed into exhausted French cavalry, Murat's men, now spent, could not hold. The Russians, with cold Russian resolve, drove them back, restoring the army of Bohemia's shattered lines and denying Napoleon the breakthrough he so desperately sought. While Napoleon battered the southern flank, his northern defenses were stretched thin. Marshal Marmont, tasked with holding Mockern against Blucher's relentless Prussians, found himself in the midst of a brutal, unforgiving battle. The ground trembled with the fury of their clash, neither side willing to yield an inch. In Mockern, the rules of war had evaporated. French and Prussian alike fought with a savage fury, showing absolutely no quarter. Mercy was a ghost, prisoners an afterthought. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse where only survival mattered. Marmont clung to Mockern throughout the day, his men holding fast against the storm of Prussian assaults. But fate intervened. A single Prussian cannonball struck a French ammunition wagon, and the ensuing explosion tore through the French ranks. The blast shattered their morale and left Marmont grievously wounded, forcing his evacuation from the field. The tide was turning. As darkness fell, the ruins of Mockern, once fiercely contested, now lay in Prussian hands. The French had been driven out, and their blood stained the streets they had fought so bitterly to hold. By the close of October the 16th, the sun sank beneath a sky thick with the smoke of battle. Napoleon had failed to smash through the army of Bohemia, and now the threat of losing Leipzig to the advancing Prussians loomed like a dark omen over his command. The following day, an uneasy silence settled over the battlefield. Neither side committed to a major assault, yet the armies swelled as reinforcements streamed in. This was no reprieve, only the calm before the storm. The Allies, already formidable, grew even stronger as the Swedes, led by Crown Prince Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a former marshal of Napoleon himself, finally arrived on the field. Their numbers and firepower now dwarfed Napoleon's dwindling forces. Had Bernadotte marched with greater urgency and joined the fray on October the 16th, the tide of the battle might have turned even sooner. Napoleon's northern flank, fragile and vastly overstretched, could have collapsed entirely, trapping the emperor in Leipzig with no escape. Yet, even arriving a day late, Bernadotte's forces swelled the Allied strength to a staggering 300,000 men and nearly 1,500 cannons, a monstrous force poised to crush Napoleon's army. Always calculating, though, Napoleon made a brief and disingenuous attempt to negotiate. But he knew the truth. There would be no peace here, no respite. He began to prepare for what he knew would be a brutal, fighting retreat, determined to bleed his enemies even as he withdrew. On October the 18th, the battle reignited with savage intensity. As the fighting raged, betrayal struck. A contingent of Saxon troops, once loyal to France, turned their backs on Napoleon and defected to the Prussians. Stunned, but resolute, Napoleon ordered his forces to fall back into Leipzig, the walls of the city becoming his last bastion. As night cloaked the battlefield, Napoleon gave the fateful command: retreat westward. There was but one road of escape, threading through the town of Lindenau, where a single, narrow stone bridge over the Elster River offered a lifeline to the fleeing French forces. But the bridge was narrow, perilously so, and soon a bottleneck formed as thousands of men and wagons jammed the crossing, panic seeping into the ranks as the Allies pressed closer. Desperate to buy time, Napoleon ordered 30,000 men to hold the line as a rear guard. Yet tragedy struck. The bridge, their only means of escape, was blown apart too early by Napoleon's forward forces. Those 30,000 men, trapped and doomed, would never cross the Elster. Chaos reigned. French soldiers, desperate to escape, died by the hundreds on the bridge, or drowned in the cold, merciless waters of the Elster. The rearguard was obliterated, leaving nothing but death in their wake. Napoleon's star, dimmed but not yet extinguished after the disaster in Russia, now fell into shadow at Leipzig. His aura of invincibility, once absolute, shattered in the ruins of this titanic defeat. His decision to march into battle with an army of boys and half-trained men had cost him dearly. Over 60,000 lay dead, wounded, or captured. The mighty force that had once shaken Europe was reduced to a mere 100,000 men as he retreated broken toward France. The march to Paris was a grim journey. Constant harassment from the pursuing allies and the steady stream of desertions cut Napoleon's army in half. By the time he reached his capital, only 60,000 men remained, a shadow of the force that had once marched east. Napoleon still sat upon his throne, but the foundations of his empire crumbled actively beneath him. His grip on power was slipping, and it was only a matter of time before even the might of his name could no longer hold France together. The Allies, though they had sacrificed 60,000 men, could afford the bloodshed. Their ranks swelled as new banners joined their cause. On October the 18th, Bavaria turned its back on Napoleon. By November, the Netherlands had risen in revolt, and the Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's once loyal creation, crumbled as its member states abandoned him to the winds of rebellion. On November the 8th, the Allies extended a final olive branch, a peace deal that would see France shrink behind the Alps and retreat from the Rhine. It was a bitter pill, but it would have saved his throne. Still, ever defiant, Napoleon rejected it outright, a fatal miscalculation that sealed his doom. With negotiations shattered, the die was cast. On December the 21st, 1813, the Allied armies surged across the Rhine, the tide of war spilling into the heart of France itself. The invasion had begun. The first 3 months of 1814 saw northern France engulfed in relentless conflict. Battle after battle scarred the land, culminating in a final, desperate clash for Paris on March the 30th. A city that had once seemed untouchable now stood on the brink of ruin. At last, on April the 11th, 1814, the unthinkable happened. Napoleon, the man who had once ruled Europe like a god of war, abdicated unconditionally. The Emperor of the French was now in exile, cast away to the small, windswept island of Elba in the Mediterranean, his empire now in ashes. Even in the twilight of his reign, Napoleon displayed the brilliance that had made him a legend. His maneuvers in the early battles of 1814 were as sharp as ever, but each victory came at a heavy cost. With every clash, his once mighty forces dwindled, bleeding out on the fields of France. After Leipzig, it became painfully clear. No matter how masterful his strategy, Napoleon could no longer bend the sheer weight of numbers to his will. The arithmetic of war had turned against him, and it was a battle even he could not win. Yet, history is often shaped by the smallest of decisions. Had Napoleon played his hand differently at Leipzig, the fate of Europe might have changed. Thousands of men left defending far-off Hamburg and Dresden could have tipped the scales. A concentrated force could have given him the hammer he needed to crush his enemies, but those men weren't there, and the moment was lost. Marmont's troops, thinly spread on the northern flank, stood no chance against the Prussian onslaught. And in the south, where the Austrians and Russians pressed hard, Napoleon's blow could have landed harder. With greater numbers, he might have shattered the army of Bohemia and turned the tide at Leipzig. Victory had been within reach, but slipped through his fingers. The Allies, despite their outward unity, were still bound by mistrust. A defeat at Leipzig might have shattered their fragile alliance, leaving them to squabble over the spoils. In that chaos, Napoleon could have regained the upper hand, forcing them to the negotiating table with much stronger terms. The window for such a victory had been narrow, but it had been real. It was the Allies, though, who emerged victorious, and in doing so, they solidified Metternich's grip on the future of Europe. By 1815, the Concert of Europe was born, a grand design to maintain a balance of power and prevent any one nation from dominating the continent as Napoleon had done. This new order, born from the ashes of Napoleon's empire, held the peace. For nearly 4 decades, the concert kept Europe's ambitions in check, its nations locked in an uneasy but stable peace that would endure until the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1854. It wasn't until the ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm II stirred in the 1880s that this delicate balance began to fracture, laying the groundwork for the storms that would come in the 20th century. Leipzig was more than just a battlefield victory. It was a turning point in history. It showed the world that even Napoleon, the man who had once seemed invincible, could be defeated. And it proved something else, that Europe's nations, fractured by war for so long, could unite, and in doing so, reshape the future of the continent.